Nintendo's third light gun game makes you feel like a cowboy. Wild Gunman makes its debut? Well, not exactly. But before we get into the game, it's important that we take a step back. We've talked a lot about the light gun series so far, but I've neglected to mention the technology behind it all. Let's start at the beginning. Nintendo's laser clay shooting system and Kosenju SP, the toy replica, worked as true light guns. Their barrels would emit a narrow beam of light that, upon striking sensors, would register a hit. It is a common misconception that the Zapper worked in a similar way. However, this would never work for a TV, as televisions can't read light from an external source, unlike these specialized devices. Instead, Nintendo's genius lies within repurposing previous contraptions. The technology inside the Zapper is almost identical to that inside Rob the Robot, but with a bit more interaction. Rob read light from the screen and reacted differently depending on what flashes it received. However, it wasn't actually plugged into the console at all. It only got to interact with the game through various smaller parts that would eventually lead to the pressing of a button. The light gun was plugged directly into the controller port on the NES, so it was able to give direct feedback to the console. Thus, when the trigger is pulled, there are a few different things that happen, depending on the game. In Duck Hunt, the screen would turn black for one frame. Then, where the ducks were, a white rectangle would appear. If the Zapper was lined up with the rectangle, it would count as a hit. The next frame would cause the background to reappear, but the duck would be absent. During this frame, the feedback would be transmitted between Zapper and console. If a hit was registered, the game would play the duck falling animation. If one wasn't, the duck would eventually fly away. All of this happens in just 3 frames of the 60 frames per second cycle, so the player would have minimal interference in normal gameplay. Hogan's Alley works slightly differently. The 1 frame of black would also occur, but afterwards the game would cycle through 1 frame for the gangsters and 1 for civilians. If a target was in the sensor, the Zapper would check to see which frame it was present for to determine if it was a winning or losing hit. Meanwhile, Game Mode C used the same principles as Duck Hunt. Wild Gunman's Game Mode A had no accuracy check at all. It was simply seeing if the player pulled the trigger faster than the allotted time, which we will get into shortly. For the other modes, it was essentially the same as Hogan's Alley. It is important to get into why exactly the Zapper had the first frame of black, though. In order to keep the peripheral cheap enough to mass produce, the technology was quite rudimentary. The gun could register light, but wouldn't be able to determine the light to be from a TV or any other source. The Zapper has to sense a change in light level for a single frame in order to register anything as a hit. This prevents cheating. Without this safeguard, the player could point the gun at any continuous light source to register a hit. While this check did prevent dishonest players, it had some unintended consequences. Because it needs exactly 1 frame in order to register anything, it also means that the Zapper isn't usable on anything that isn't a CRT TV. If you've ever watched fighting game tournaments, you may have wondered why they only use these older TVs. Newer televisions have a few frames of lag between input and output, meaning that inputs for technical games are less precise. While this doesn't impact the average person in the average game, it does make the likes of Super Smash Bros. And Street Fighter very difficult when many inputs are frame perfect in nature. It also means that the technology of Rob and the Zapper is incompatible. Of course, emulation for these games exists through various first and third-party methods, as Nintendo did re-release these 3 1985 games on the eShop for Wii and Wii U. However, there is something to be said for experiencing these games on their original hardware. As time goes on and technology breaks down, it will become more and more difficult to properly play these games as the developers intended. With this depressing intro out of the way, let's talk about one forgettable light gun game that won't be missed by the slow march of time: Wild Gunman. At its surface, Wild Gunman's premise is even simpler than that of Hogan Alley's or Duck Hunt's. Shoot the enemy as quickly as you can. However, when you go a bit deeper, nope, that's basically the entire game. The 3 game modes are simply different variations on this theme. Game A is against a single enemy, Game B is against 2 enemies, and Game C features whack-a-mole style shooting against several bad guys in a saloon. As previously mentioned, Game A doesn't actually check for accuracy, making the mode feel like a reaction test with Nintendo aesthetics. The one speck of depth I can gather is that, while players progress through the game, they will likely be able to identify which characters are faster than others. This is implemented in Game B, which can get a bit tricky. Precise aim is necessary here, and identifying which cowboy to shoot first becomes quite useful. However, it does get repetitive fast. Game C is a boiled down version of Hogan Alley's side-scroller, with no fakeouts and only 5 windows to pay attention to. Overall, the gameplay is quite lacking, and certainly did not age particularly well when compared to its 2 other 1985 competitors. While it is true that Wild Gunman is better known today than the other Zapper titles, such as Hogan's Alley or Gumshoe, this can mostly be attributed to its popularity as an arcade machine and the pop culture references that ensued. Wild Gunman actually came out as an arcade cabinet in Japan in 1974, and it was quite popular then. When it was brought to the US in 1976, it celebrated similar success. The game also made several cameos in the Back to the Future franchise. In Part 2, Marty McFly is seen playing an arcade cabinet resembling Wild Gunman's Versus System version, attributing his sharp aiming skills later in the film to his many hours of practice on the game. There isn't a whole lot to say in regards to Wild Gunman's impact on future video games. In Kirby's Adventure for the NES, Quick Draw is a minigame that takes inspiration from the likes of Wild Gunman. Similar to the black box title, there are 5 characters with increasing speed that Kirby must beat in a shoot-off. The fact that this concept was relegated to a minigame in a title also made for the NES says a lot about the standing of Wild Gunman itself. It is undeniable that the simple design of the game worked very well in arcades. It just didn't translate particularly well to the console experience, which was better suited for more complex titles that allowed for replayability. That's not to say every aspect of the game was subpar. The 5 gunmen's character sprites were large and detailed, and it is possible that Nintendo took inspiration from themselves when designing the characters in Punch-Out! The sprites look similar, and notably have the same exaggerated, surprised expressions when the player successfully strikes them. The iconic gunmen also get a cute little cameo as Duck hunts down B in Super Smash Bros. 1-2 Switch features a quick draw game that brings the concept of Wild Gunman into the 21st century. But beyond that and its re-release for the Wii and Wii U's eShop, that's where the game's legacy ends. Wild Gunman had its moment in the eye of the public, but without the push that it received from the film industry, it is very likely that it would have fallen into obscurity a lot faster. And so, we wrap up our look at the 1985 Light Gun series titles on a bit of a low note. After all, Wild Gunman's most well-known clone is the Human Benchmark's reaction time test. Between Wild Gunman's middling gameplay and the realization that these titles may soon be unplayable, it may feel as if all hope is lost. But don't worry, we will soon jump into a whole new series of black box games, starting with one of the best in the entire set. Stay tuned, because up next we've got a small group of oddballs included in the Programmable series.